So welcome everybody. This is the panel on AI and climate and energy. So you know you're in the right place. I'm really excited that we've got such a heavyweight panel to discuss this topic with us today. I hope that the panel will contribute to myth busting around this issue and show both the positive contribution that AI can play in the environmental and energy space, but also the nature of the challenges that AI also brings with it in terms of energy use, and then turn to solutions, both solutions from industry and also governance solutions that hopefully don't stifle innovation. So just to introduce our panel, we have Camilla Winlo on my left, head of data privacy at Gemserv, one of the generous sponsors of this summit we have. Immediately to my right is B. Longworth, the director of NVIDIA Government Relations. Next along, we have Charlie Wilson, professor of energy and climate change at Oxford University, and David Rowlands, global head of AI at KPMG. So I couldn't think of a better panel, really, to cover all the different aspects of this topic. I'm going to pose three kind of questions to the panel, and then we're in the second half of the conversation, we're going to open up to Q&A for you. So to start off with the positive contribution that AI can make, there's a range of exciting areas from climate modeling through digital twins, new materials research, enhancing grid efficiency, or just the greater demand for data centers driving efficiencies and lowering the cost of new renewables. So, Charlie, could you possibly lead us off with some reflections on that?
Yes, thank you. So there are many positive use cases for AI and digitalization more broadly, both to help directly reduce our energy demands and the greenhouse gas emissions that follow from that. And there are also many use cases of digitalization and AI enabling the broader sort of effort towards reaching net zero. So in terms of the sort of more direct implications, data-driven management of increasingly complex electricity systems, which have intermittent renewable generators that output following the wind or the sun, but they have to be in constant balance with demands, which varies over the course of a day and obviously over the course of seasons. This is an increasingly complex task of managing bidirectional electricity flows, not just from generation to demand, but also with storage resources, with when we charge our electric vehicles, with when we run our heat pumps, and so on and so on and so on. So this is a big data challenge, which AI is proving to be extremely helpful for in that integration. That results not just in stimulation for more intermittent renewables, but also stimulation for more demand flexibility of us in our homes, in our buildings, and when we charge our vehicles and so on. So data is critical in this respect. There are many use cases of smart controls in building systems, for example, to manage thermal energy demand in our buildings. There are many use cases looking at data-driven optimization of how transportation systems work to improve flow rates, to increase ridership of public transit, for example. And all of these kind of essentially in the slightly medium to longer term will directly help reduce the energy footprint of economic and social activity. And then briefly, there are these more kind of enabling implications around, for example, improved climate modeling, improved weather prediction, materials discovery, for example, for new catalysts in batteries, which could potentially help drive step change reductions in emissions as well. There is another side to the story, and we'll come to this, I think, a bit later.
Thanks, Charlie. B.
Yeah, so I'm really happy that we're talking about this topic today, and I believe that the panel came about as a result of the conversation about the aspects of AI and generative AI that are a bit neglected. I think this one is incredibly important, both from kind of a moral point of view, if you care about climate, which I hope everybody in this room does, but also from a commercial point of view. So the AI for good conversation has become a bit unfashionable, honestly. It's become a bit uncool to talk about AI for good. You either sound hopelessly optimistic, or for a technology company, and I'm kind of both. So I understand if you had some initial skepticism, but hopefully I can win you over a bit. But when I looked at the incredible range of use cases, and Charlie's just mentioned some fantastic ones, specifically in the context of the energy network, energy security, and climate science. I think that very often when we approach this conversation about energy and AI, there's sort of an unspoken assumption that using energy for AI is wasting energy. It's just cuter pictures of cats. And I think that's why it's incredibly important for us to persist through sounding a bit uncool and just really talk about those incredible use cases that AI can help to unlock. As a society, we face some really tough challenges right now, and anybody who picks up a newspaper or listens to a podcast recently is going to be all too aware of that. And if we're going to have a chance of being able to address climate change, develop treatments for diseases and approaches to healthcare for an aging population, manage our economic competitiveness as a nation, then we really need AI as a tool to help us in those incredible challenges. And I think that that's why this conversation today is so important, because if we don't solve the challenges around being able to adequately provision energy for AI and balance that against all of the other needs for energy that are out there, whether it's industrial, consumers, and layer on top of that, being able to achieve our climate goals, then we're never going to achieve that kind of AI opportunity. There's a lot of conversation about AI risk, which is absolutely as it should be. I think one of the risks that doesn't get talked about enough is the risk of not achieving the benefits of AI. What are the risks of missing out on that opportunity? So me as a tech company, we produce essentially the hardware and software that then scientists and researchers and developers use to create different AI applications. We work globally. We have a view across all industries, scientific disciplines, because we just kind of work with everybody. And that gives us an interesting perspective and the ability to see some of the sort of macro trends that are going on out there. And one that we see really clearly right now is that the availability of energy to power data centers is a bottleneck for AI deployment. So anybody who's worried or is rightly skeptical about a tech company wading into this issue on purely moral grounds, be reassured this is also a commercial imperative. If we don't get this right from a business point of view, this is also a huge problem, quite apart from the need to get it right to achieve our climate goals.
That's great, Bea. Thank you. Camilla, I would ask you your title of Head of Data Privacy. I think belies the fact that actually you and your company have been doing some really valuable and relevant research on the environmental aspects of AI. So over to you.
Yeah, so for those of you who may be wondering why somebody who works in data privacy is on this panel, I have a number of different hats, and the company that I work for specialises in low carbon and energy, as well as being part of a wider technology consultancy group globally that builds AI platforms. And we've been building things like we have a tool called My eCarbon that organisations can use to map their digital carbon footprint. So there are all sorts of tools like that you can build that allow people to see their impact in the world in ways that would otherwise be quite sort of invisible. And this is part of what AI can do within the energy economy. That's the other thing I should probably mention. I'm also the chair of the privacy subcommittee for the Smart Energy Code, which governs data coming out of smart meters. So if you look at the information that people are starting to have available to them now about how they use energy and their impact on the environment, there is a wealth more information available to people than there ever was before that allows you to understand the impact of your behaviour and to change it. And we haven't had that previously. That's been really difficult to see and understand. So a lot of the time, and again, sort of this ties in with privacy as well, all of these things are sort of externalities. So you see the impact of what it is you're trying to achieve. What you don't see is the costs that fall outside of your own little business case. So you see, I don't know, you're going to have a Teams meeting, let's say, with a couple of other people to talk about a project. You might think about what impact that's going to have on the project, but not think about the 25 kilos of carbon that you just generated from the Teams meeting. And yet that information is now starting to become available to people. But we do need to make sure that people see it, because these tools are so easy to use and they have so much flow to them that actually being able to understand that impact and to understand when it's relevant and appropriate to have that impact is something that I think we all need to get a lot more aware of. And again, AI is going to help us to do that. So another fun little statistic for you. Every time you do a GPT-4 search, you use a pint of water in the process. But again, people sort of don't necessarily think about those sorts of consequences. And yet we're now in a position where AI can surface those things and get people to really think about their impact and think about, more broadly than just energy as well. So it allows us to think about things that we haven't really been able to engage with before. So from a data privacy perspective, bias is a really big thing. Now, computers only do what humans do, but you can look at an algorithm and you can look at the outcomes from an algorithm. And as you develop those algorithms, part of what's expected is that you're going to think about the consequences of the algorithms and how they might be biased and how they might have unintended consequences. Those conversations don't really happen that well when you're just getting humans to do things, because we just assume that common sense will work. And yet, obviously, we're all humans, we're all flawed, we're all biased in ways that we may not even recognise in ourselves. But as soon as you start putting those things into AI, you're putting them into the world in a way that we can all engage with in a really new and interesting way. So I think on that point, I will wrap myself up because I could keep going forever.
That was great, Camilla. So David, you're responsible for the rollout of responsible AI, both for clients and for all the internal teams in KPMG. So I'd love your reflections on this question.
Yeah, we actually call it trusted AI, which you may think we're splitting hairs, but we think being trusted is a more active responsibility than the word responsible AI, and so an example is KPMG put its trusted AI framework out actually a number of years ago, and it consists of 10 capabilities that you need to master if you want to be trusted in the use of AI, and it's, you could all get hold of that. And it covers factors such as transparency, which Camilla touched on, or explainability, data integrity, the security and the privacy. If you want to be trusted, it covers two more factors. One is fairness and the other one is sustainability. So we believe it's incumbent on all consumers of AI to design in energy and particularly carbon use and water and factors such as that. Build it in by design. And I think when we're talking about demands of energy on AI, inference seems to be significantly more energy demanding than the training, actually. So this is when it gets out into the world and people are tuning it and using it in the real world. And the theme yesterday was very much about making sure that we're using AI to a clear purpose if we want to get through to outcomes. And so really understanding the question that we're trying to solve, that was a big topic of debate yesterday. And so we think there's a bit of a gap there at the moment. We're making sure that we're deeply understanding the question and doing more rigorous solutioning over the way in which you piece together components of AI against that problem are super important. Are we using the right model? So the models have huge ranges, not only in price, you have 50 times difference in price that you're using them, but they also have big range in the demands on energy and on water. So are we using the right model for the right job? Do we need to use Gen AI at all? Can we use some of the more traditional solutions? Are we tuning it in the right way? And we talk about resource augmented generation, and the key word there is augmented. So at KPMG, we've been talking about content-led RAG. So in other words, are we putting our experts, we've got 150 years of history of people developing great expertise in their fields, are we using them to narrow down the use of the models to the business case or the use case that we're trying to solve? A good example is, regulation. You can process AI over the top of quite complex regulatory models, and they're inherently inconsistent. If you have somebody who really understands regulation and has worked in that sphere for a number of years, then you can tune it down to the right kind of purpose, and then the amount of energy you're using is crashing. And so if in order to get that solutioning right, you probably need to start reusing components of AI. And so we're building a multimodal, multi-model platform that enables you to reuse components of AI in multiple different situations. Building in there the kind of telemetry that Camilla just talked about. Are you measuring how much of the AI energy you're using against what kind of business case? So at least you can track that and start to move that out to decision making and to pricing. And so we're building that into a model. And of course, lots of, especially large organizations, will do the same. And then I think we need to get into skills. People need to prompt much more carefully. Every time you experiment, you use a pint of water. It's been a feature, hasn't it? Experimentation. And so we need to probably consider the full price of experimentation and actually give our people the skills to prompt more carefully. And then we're moving into this, and that becomes more acute as we move into agentic AI, because agents, they start to chain the processing. And so if you're setting off a chain of processing, you better know that you've set it off in the right direction to a good purpose before you start generating huge demands on energy and water. So that skills thing is super important as well.
That's great, David. I think that's a really nice segue into our next section, where we're actually looking at understanding the full life cycle of AI across hardware, software, and data. And these are all interconnected energy challenges, but the opportunities for each are different. As you alluded to, David, the focus on the past has been on the energy and water use of testing and training models. But I think we've got the potential explosion in energy use arising from inference and AI agents. And by definition, AI agents are semi-autonomous. So I'd be interested in panels' kind of reflections on, are there effective ways in which we can embed in software a way of tracking the path of agents and perhaps create a market-friendly approach to creating a market for environmentally favorable agents. The statistics are pretty remarkable. Camilla, you mentioned that a chat GPT search takes a pint of water. Estimates are that it, compared to a simple Google search, takes between 8 and 100 times more energy to conduct that same search. The water use of AI is to cool data centers. You need clean water, and usually it's through evaporation. It's estimated that it will use as much water as 4 times the water use of Denmark. The electricity use also is remarkable. The amount of electricity that Argentina uses. I saw yesterday also the Financial Times, who's done some really excellent reporting on the energy aspects of AI, reported on the International Energy Agency's report, which showed that electricity use is increasing significantly, not just from AI, but also from electrification of vehicles and from increase in air conditioning. So we're looking at, I think it's 1,000 terawatt hours additionally a year. So that's equivalent to adding a Japan of electricity demand every year going forward, every single year. So it is very significant, but I think it connects to B's point that part of the challenge is actually access of AI to electricity among a very crowded demand space. We saw instances like Ireland had to do a moratorium on data centers for 3 years because of the disruption caused through its grid. So I want to go in the same order as the last question, and start with Charlie. What do you feel what's the true nature, if we're going to do some myth busting on this issue?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's two important distinctions to make. One is between the sort of globalized dimension to the problem, and then between the very kind of localized impacts that might occur with specific data centers connecting to specific electricity networks in specific places. And then the second important distinction is between the direct energy and environmental footprint of the data centers themselves, and then what I was talking about before, the kind of indirect implications of what the data center, what the AI that runs on the data centers gets used in terms of energy activity. So on the first point, the direct energy footprint of IT infrastructure worldwide is roughly 2 to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and very similar percent of global electricity consumption. The data centers traditionally have been very roughly a third, the network infrastructure a third, and then all the end use devices another third. The data center bit is obviously rising very rapidly. There's some of these International Energy Agency projections showing things like in Ireland, it's currently around 15% of total electricity, could be up to 30% by 2030. Denmark up to 9%, and other parts of the world up to, typically you're talking numbers in the sort of 5 to 8% sort of range of total electricity. Electricity, you mentioned all of the new demands we're placing on the electricity networks. I mean, paradoxically, from a climate point of view, this is generally a good thing, because of all the energy carriers, electricity is the easiest one to decarbonize through renewable and also nuclear. It's the sort of direct use of fossil fuels in industry and for driving our cars, which is more problematic from a hard point of view. So we want more electrification. Electricity as the energy resource used in our buildings and our vehicles is a much more efficient way of using energy than directly burning fossil fuels. But we need to be able to expand the electricity system rapidly enough with renewables. And interestingly, as we're seeing now with some nuclear, both old nuclear that's being reactivated in 3 Mile Island in the US, but also small modular nuclear reactors that are increasingly being sourced and experimented with. So this sort of part of the story is an active area of innovation and change in the industry to manage that, both the energy and the carbon footprint. That's not to say that I think you were mentioning on a localized basis in terms of specific electricity networks or specific places with water shortage problems, there are local constraints on the data with data center impacts. But really, the sort of bigger picture for me is about how AI and Gen AI is used to potentially transform social and economic activities that have large resource footprints. So we talked earlier about many of the positive use cases. There are also problematic use cases, negative use cases. So just as you can use data-driven approaches to improve output from your renewable energy facilities, you can also use data-driven approaches to reduce the cost and friction of extracting fossil fuels from the ground. There was a case a few years ago, a tie-in between Microsoft and ExxonMobil, where Exxon reported that digitalization of their operations would allow them to increase their pumping rate by 50,000 barrels of oil per day. So this is sort of digitalization used to help drive fossil fuels. There's also the broader issue that when you make processes more efficient and you reduce the energy inputs to those processes, you tend to have this rebound effect where you drive growth in those processes. So if they are energy hungry activities like moving goods and people around the planet, then you tend to you make it more efficient, you make it cheaper, and therefore you induce more activity. And this rebound effect can offset some of the efficiency gains that you make from deployment of these data-driven solutions. So there are sort of both negative use cases and also double-edged swords, cases in which you can deploy things in a certain way, that like self-driving vehicles or mobility platforms, shared mobility platforms can be deployed in ways which help reduce aggregate energy consumption, or deployed in ways which result in rebounds and an increase in aggregate energy consumption. So all of these things, in this case, there was a lot of talk yesterday about AI, Gen AI being a means, not an end. So the end to which we put these tools in terms of energy hungry activities in our economy will ultimately shape whether the net impact of AI is beneficial or adverse.
That was great, Charlie. Thanks. I think particularly your disaggregation of the different levels of the problem was really useful. NVIDIA's really been a leader in its sector in in taking a full stack approach to sustainability. What do you see are it's the nature of the challenge that NVIDIA's having to tackle, and where do you see the opportunities and also the difficulties in this area?
So, as I mentioned, NVIDIA makes the hardware and software tools people use to go off and do AI to whatever they want to do it to. We're a fabulous company, so we don't manufacture, but nevertheless, we have a complex supply chain and we have a complex network of different companies in our ecosystem that we work with. So we're looking at every aspect of that to try and make sure that every aspect is infused with sustainability. Our own operations will be completely powered by renewable energy by next year. But I think it's incumbent on every company and every organization to really focus on where they can have the greatest impact in this problem. And from our point of view, we feel that because we do make those AI tools, that's where we really need to focus. And so with the generation of our core technology, our graphics processing unit, which is effectively the processing engine of AI, we call it Blackwell. It was engineered from the ground up for sustainability. And when we think about the software tools that we put around it, they're also really focused on that efficient use of energy piece. So looking back across the time that NVIDIA has been working in the AI space, between 2016 and 2025, we will have made AI training and inference 10,000 times more energy efficient. So we feel quite good about that, but there's still a lot of work to do. To put that in perspective, if we had been able to improve the efficiency of cars, the internal combustion engine, by the same amount that NVIDIA has improved the efficiency of AI training and inference, your car would now be able to do 280,000 miles to the gallon, although hopefully you're going to invest in an electric vehicle instead if you haven't already done so. So it's that energy efficiency piece that we think is really, really important. It's about how much useful work, AI work, can you get done within a certain amount of energy. And these energy efficiency gains in the hardware and software tools effectively mean that either you can do the same amount of useful work with less energy, or within the same energy envelope, you can do more useful work. And for us, that's an incredibly important equation to be able to make in order that we can try and balance this need to not only achieve our digitization goals, but also our climate goals, that the one doesn't kind of compromise the other. So from our point of view, that's a contribution we're seeking to make. In addition, we're working on helping to apply those efficient hardware and software tools to some of these incredibly important problems, including climate science. We have a platform, for example, called Earth-2, where we've been able to accelerate climate simulation and prediction by an order of magnitude over what's been possible in the past. We still have a lot of work to do, and our goal is to continue on that path of making sure that the technology on which AI is based is more and more efficient, so that when we put it together with those other pieces of the puzzle that Charlie was talking about in terms of renewable energy networks, using AI to be able to integrate those more effectively into our grid, being able to use AI to improve our energy security, that we start to see more of a virtuous circle effect. And again, we are able to achieve that balance, and we don't face that false choice between digitization and climate.
Thanks, B. Yeah, I just got back from Singapore and then UAE, and I could see the remarkable investment in the UAE in this space. So NVIDIA's partnership with G42 with the Earth-2 model was really quite inspiring, as well as the UAE's commitment that all new data centers will be powered by new renewables. So I think it's a very exciting space. And just to flag up in that area of atmospheric modeling, a colleague of mine, Professor Philip Steer at Rubin College, is heading a new intelligent Earth project on atmospheric modeling using a digital twin. So if any of you are interested in that area, come up to me afterwards and we can talk more about it. Camilla.
Yeah. So carry on talking about the social side of it then, do something different. So what's really interesting to me is at the moment, AI is yet another technology that's essentially transferring wealth from poor people to rich people right And it's doing that for a number of different reasons. So one of them is in order to really engage on a personal level with your energy consumption. So I'm thinking about things like deciding that you're going to put solar panels on your house. You have to have a property where you've got the rights to do that. Probably means you're a homeowner, probably means that you've got a reasonably large property and you're doing quite well for yourself. If you live in a flat, you won't be able to do that. If you're in rented accommodation, it's not possible. And at the moment, we are encouraging those kinds of activities through tariffs, like feed-in tariffs. Not so much as we have been doing, but that essentially mean that everybody pays a little bit more on their energy bill so that people who are taking those actions, who have the money and the resources to do that, can reduce their own carbon footprint. So that's one way where you're essentially saying people who can't afford to do this themselves are subsidising and encouraging people who can. So you have a transfer of wealth. You have something similar on a sort of a more global scale as well. So just go back, finish my point. So solar panels and things matter because that's the sort of thing where you're really engaging with flexibility tariffs in a positive way. The negative side of that is, and as part of, I mentioned, I chaired the privacy subcommittee for the Smart Energy Code. We've been running a research project on what AI is going to mean for the energy industry in the UK and for smart meter data. And one of the interviews I conducted for that was with the Citizens Advice, and they're very concerned that flexibility tariffs for people who haven't got the resources to do things like put solar panels on their house, it may turn them nocturnal. It may cause them to change their way of living in the world because you essentially end up with peak time power usage becoming uneconomically viable for them. And so you find yourself having to do all of your chores, all of your electricity usage overnight when it's cheaper, which is a fundamental shift to how people are living their lives. That's a real concern for Citizens Advice at the moment. On a more global scale, the countries that are investing in a significant way in AI at the moment are Western. They are also the ones where the way that generative AI is going to be built is going to include cultural biases that are from those countries, and that it's going to sort of mean that the initial benefits of AI are going to be concentrated in countries that are already doing well. At the same time, the sort of extractive costs of it, so things like the mining for the energy and the mining to build the data centres, they're happening in countries that are not getting the same benefits from AI at the moment, and there isn't really an expectation that they're going to do that in the near term. So you have this sort of social issue that goes along with the energy usage that actually, on a sort of an industrial scale, absolutely, there's a lot of good stuff going on that over the time, over the future, is going to improve how this works. And it will mean that, it's absolutely seen in the energy industry as being fundamental to achieving net zero. The amount of energy savings that AI-driven models can find are quite exceptional at the moment. I'm sure it will tail off over time. But at the moment, it can make a big difference. But where it makes a big difference, that's the thing, really, from a social point of view, because it is concentrated in places that already have sort of productivity and sort of cultural and all of those sorts of benefits.
Yeah.
So
that's great.
That's funny.
Thanks, Camilla. I mean, I think it's such an important point to both look at the national and the global, and to highlight inequality and poverty. It reminds me that the recent report of the Secretary General's UN High-Level Advisory Board on AI, it interviewed experts around the world and asked them over the next 3 years, what areas is AI going to be most impactful, most helpful? And the top 3 were productivity, health, and education. Climate was around the middle, but the bottom 3 were gender equality, poverty alleviation, and reducing inequality. And if we think about sustainability across the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's so important that we keep in mind in all of this, that we do keep thinking about the poverty, gender, and inequality elements as we progress. I could David, if you could give your insights on
Yes. So the 2 to 4% global emissions that data centers are driving, I mean, that's what's it to a point where it's about to take some kind of traditional villain industries such as aviation and despite your best and so it's interesting to listen to some of the pros and positives that AI is driving and some of the negatives that it's driving, and then you're left thinking, look, this thing is everything everywhere all the time. It's out there. The genie's out of the bottle. And so you start to think about, well, are we aligning incentives, driving regulation, and good governance over organisations? So some of the natural incentives are aligned here. So like Bee's describing, it is rational for providers of infrastructure and technology organisations to innovate to reduce the amount of energy usage because it aligns with cost. And also performance and latency. And then sort of trend, which is that we will all want to have AI on our devices. And so edge computing will naturally and more efficient of energy in that sense. But beyond that, then you start looking at regulation. Of course, we've got now mature ESG governance reporting, and there's carbon accounting and systems, and a drive for greater transparency uses of carbon. And I think actually AI is one of the great uses cases of AI is it does help us analyze efficiently and at scale how effectively organizations are reporting against a stated regulatory standard. And a lot of the regulation led by the EU AI Act is driven around transparency, which Camilla's very first points. And others will follow in that direction. I think that's generally the direction the US is going. But regulation is lagging. Regulation will always lag the innovation in the field of AI and AI provision, and therefore it does leave a gap for corporates to have and drive a responsibility for good corporate governance ahead of global regulation, especially around their use of energy consuming drivers of AI.
Great, David. Thank you. You're really good at the segues to the next segment. And I must confess that while I'm responsible for 1% of all aviation emissions in the world, I'm probably responsible for 50% of all multimodal video prompts to create cute pictures of cats.
Totally balanced.
So I don't which to feel more guilty about. Anyway, we're going on to the final section, which is before, and if we can keep our answers fairly nimble on this to have maximum time for Q&A. We're looking at what are the solutions? What are the industry solutions? David, you talked about the fact that the kind of auditing of energy consumption of AI, that there's work around this on the full life cycle. So what are the kind of standards to look at? Is it the World Resource Institute's greenhouse gas protocols? Are they the appropriate standard? Are there other competing ones, climate change initiative ones, and so on? Is it realistic for new data centers to be powered by renewables? What about nuclear has been mentioned? We've seen a lot of the low-hanging fruit already sort of address sort of taking nuclear out of kind of mothballing, but new modular nuclear takes 8 to 15 years to build. So is that, what do we do about that lag time? So I'll go back in the same order and just kind of reflect on both kind of industry solutions and are there governance solutions, including regulation. And the final area might be also standards. The ITU, ISO, IEEE, IEC are all meeting in India at the moment today, looking at digital standards and to what extent do we need to kind of synchronize and standardize our way that we measure the environmental impact of AI across hardware, software, and data.
So, in the same order, Charlie.
Yes, there's so much to talk about here, so I'll try and constrain myself to 3 points. So the first on the renewables, the second on data center efficiency, and then the third on the sort of broader application domain. So on the renewables point, I mean, the growth in renewables worldwide, I mean, nothing to do with, regardless of data centers, has been extremely rapid, it has been extremely rapid over the past 10 to 15 years due to exponential declines in the cost, particularly of solar, but also of wind. So the International Energy Agency estimates in the next 3 years, all of the global growth in electricity demand will essentially be covered by renewables. So renewables is about a third of total global electricity. Low carbon electricity, if you also include nuclear, is about half. So the build rates of renewables are very, very, very fast. So it seems reasonable to think that the incremental demand from additional new data centers could be covered by incremental growth in renewables. The nuclear story, for me, I mean, I also share a lot of skepticism about the build rates of nuclear. Historically, they've been in the West, certainly the last 30, 40 years, characterized by huge time and cost overruns. Yeah. The small modular nuclear reactors being very strongly promoted by the industry, and particularly actors like Rolls-Royce who build the reactors. And I think it's too early to see whether those build times can be dramatically reduced to the timescales that the AI data center boom would need. I remain kind of fairly skeptical of that, but I'm interested to see. On the data centers themselves, so there are both voluntary codes of conduct. For example, the Climate Neutrality Pact in the EU looks to try and reduce the overall, improve the overall efficiency of data centers by 2025 and then to 2030, and also to source 75% of the power from renewables by 2025 and then 100% by 2030. So these are starting to become kind of goals, like voluntary standards, and also potentially regulation within the EU under the Energy Efficiency Directive to continually improve the data center efficiency. And that also, when you look at the best-in-class data centers, which have this key metrics called the power usage effectiveness, which is the ratio of the total amount of energy needed to run the data center to the total amount of energy needed to run the IT equipment. So the closer that gets down to 1, then essentially the less energy you're needing for cooling, lighting, and all the other stuff that isn't direct computation. So the best-in-class data centers have these PUEs down around 1.1. And so there's many examples of how you can build data centers that are highly energy efficient. And then on the third point, quickly, in the application domain, so all of the uses of AI, like typically, as in how we use them in our buildings, in our transport systems, in our scientific laboratories, and so on. That ultimately is a governance question that relates much more broadly to how we're trying to tackle climate change across all these energy and emitting sectors. So it's almost like where the ICT sector sort of passes or shares responsibility with all of the people designing mobility platforms, building systems, and so on and so on and so on, all of these energy using things in our economy. And there, climate policy and climate governance is stronger in some domains than it is in other domains. But it's not, you can see in all the activity outside around us, not everything is pushing in the direction of reducing energy and reducing emissions to zero. So AI then essentially becomes an amplifier of whatever trends are going on in those application domains, both for better and for worse. This calls for strong climate policy and climate governance rather than specifically tasking the AI industry with addressing that.
That's great, Charlie. And I have a really interesting point about the EU Energy Efficiency Directive, because there's been quite a lot of talk about the EU AI Act being a missed opportunity for sustainability, but to hear that actually there's other parts of the EU machinery which is at least addressing this.
Yeah, so let me start with the energy piece. Charlie alluded earlier to the idea that's a bit kind of counterintuitive, that we shouldn't see a rise in demand for energy as something that's negative, both from the point of view of being an easier solution to decarbonise, but also to Camilla's point about social implications. A rise in energy usage, thinking globally, is probably going to correlate to an increase in living standards. So I think from that point of view, it's incredibly important that we do see this uptick in renewables, nuclear, extremely divisive, and logistical challenges as well, but it's a piece of the puzzle. And I think from that point of view, when we think about the entire energy mix that we need, there's actually a point of view that says that the rise in demand specifically for energy related to AI is potentially going to create market forces that support that transition and that uptick in overall energy generation skewed towards renewable sources. So from that point of view, I think it's even a reason to be hopeful about us achieving that bigger energy picture that we want to see. I'm also very glad that you raised the topic of PUE, power effectiveness usage, which is an acronym that I've had to learn recently. And I think that anybody who's involved in technology in any way and has ever had anything to do with benchmarking knows that this is a fun game. Things are very rarely apples to apples. The person who writes the benchmark wins the benchmark. And so it's a really important conversation to have about the specific metrics that we use in order to measure energy usage and effectiveness in this space. All have to be having the same conversation. Saying that and specifically talking about PUE, what we see is that conversation needs to be extremely thoughtful to avoid unintended consequences. And you rightly said with power usage effectiveness, you end up with this ratio. The lower the ratio, the better. But the nature of the metric means that it doesn't take into account the compute effectiveness of the data center. So it actually doesn't reward using more effective hardware. So in fact, you could use PUE to incentivize a data center that uses less energy, but is also less performant in terms of the work that it can get done. So if you have a certain amount of work to do, maybe you need 3 data centers instead of 1 to get it done. So you're actually incentivizing less energy efficiency rather than more. So I'm not saying in any way that it's not a useful metric, because it is, but it needs to be part of the mix. And we add in other metrics like performance per watt, where you're really talking about that amount of useful work you can get done per unit of energy in order to have a complete conversation and in order to avoid those unintended consequences. And as Charlie mentioned, with the upcoming European directive on that, it's going to be very important to get it right so that that's a useful and helpful piece of regulation.
Thank you, B. Great point. Camilla.
So I think what I want to talk about is what it's like on the ground, right? People on the panel with me are clearly brilliant, extremely curious, and know a lot about what's going on. Your average Joe isn't, right? And so, again, going back to the AI research that we've been doing, one of the challenges that was coming up through that research was that the energy companies are finding that it's not a sexy sector to go and work in, and they really struggle to compete with companies like NVIDIA. Even academia at the moment as well is a much more exciting place to go and work. So while they can find people who can do the work, they're not getting these guys. So the difference that makes is that you end up with people who know something and that one piece of knowledge sticks, and it doesn't really get the same sort of level of improvement that you get when you're these guys or you guys in the audience. And so what that does is it means that when I'm going and talking to the energy companies and asking them to tell me about governance and about what best practice is around AI, all they'll tell me in return at the moment is that the regulators are behind the curve, that people haven't worked out what the risks of AI are. And it's all these stories from 2 or 3 years ago because they made headlines at the time. And they're not curious enough to go and find out how people have responded to those headlines and what they know now, and how our current state of knowledge and our current state of best practice has changed over time. So if I'm going to say, what do I think is the challenge? I actually think that part of the challenge is we could do with some really amazing AI communicators who can really work on getting those stories out into journalism and pushing the knowledge to the people on the ground floor that are doing the work. Because they don't know, and they are working on old data. They have no idea what you guys are doing at the moment, unfortunately. And they're responding on old information in this sort of less curious framework. So that would be the thing for me, more communication and be really proactive.
Thank you, Camilla.
That's great. David, you're a very trust and delivery focused person. What's your perspective on the solution?
I'll be super quick. I was just reflecting how this problem is actually characterized by huge institutions with huge sunk costs. They're faced with enormous infrastructure investments, which take a long time. And so two thoughts. One is going back to where we started with the positive uses of AI is great at solving something like that, as we're trying to transition against some quite complex sunk cost and fixed cost investments against, a dynamic and changing environment. But secondly, you start to think about role of state. And I know it's very unfashionable to consider that, but, policy, when you were talking about, will the timing of nuclear power fit the demands of, much more dynamic demands of data centers? Well, maybe that's the situation for states to step into. And I am struck at how direct the relationship between Microsoft and the 3 Mile Island was, with no state intervention into them. I just think there is a policy / state regulation question to be had in that.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, David. Okay, I'm going to open it up. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, starting.
So a lot of companies are sort of going after this carbon neutral messaging when they release emission, and then they will go ahead and plant trees that invest in environmental stability. Is this the right way to approach how we think about the environment, especially when it comes to electricity, energy, AI? Should we be thinking more about how you reduce the emissions in the first place instead of going ahead and investing in this sort of environment?
Thank you.
We're talking about LLMs, and you rightly pointed out having ChatGPT write a 100-word email uses 500 milliliters of water, let alone the energy use. I feel like we're using super powerful systems to do super simple things. And there's a solution here in small language models that run on device, which is Apple's model of how they're bringing AI into the iPhone. It's not here yet, but it's coming soon. So isn't that a potential solution? I'm curious, especially in your answer to this, in getting businesses to use LLMs to solve a problem and then training a small language model that runs on device to reduce the ongoing climate impact.
Great. Yes.
Thank you. I have a question for Charlie. I'm just kind of wondering about the power demand outlook, because my understanding from talking to European utilities, for example, is that even though there will be remarkable renewable build out, it's not going to be enough to power all the data center demand. And as you pointed out, nuclear is not catching up quickly enough as well. It's untested. The consensus seems to be, especially in the States, they will have to bring more gas onto the line and maybe even turn back to coal. What is the kind of, solution to this constraint, basically, that's curtailing, I guess, data centers and AI?
Thank you. Charlie, I'm going to ask you to answer that because it was specified. And then anybody else can volunteer to answer one of them only. Face the other two.
So I think the constraints you mentioned are very, very, I think B mentioned this, the constraints are very, very real in specific locations where either there's insufficient renewables capacity, there's insufficient new land to build renewables, there's insufficient network capacity to take on additional large load centers like data centers, and so on and so on. And this is why, for example, Ireland and the Netherlands and Singapore, for example, recently have had moratorium on building new data centers. But I think if you take the EU, if you again kind of zoom upwards to the sort of macro level, then again, the build rates of renewables in Europe generally, and in some parts of Europe, like the UK particularly, are so rapid that I think they are sufficient to meet the incremental demands of new data centers. So there's both a sort of macro perspective and then a very micro perspective, and the constraints are much more evident at the micro perspective.
Right. Anybody else like to answer?
Can I give a really unsatisfying answer to all 3 questions, which is that it's complicated. From the point of view of what should companies be doing, should be doing this and that? The answer is yes, they should be doing everything. It's not enough just to focus on after the fact mitigation. You should also be taking steps to reduce energy consumption. From the point of view of the energy network question, this is so complex. It's not just about getting those renewables online. It's about planning. It's about energy pricing. It's about how energy is allowed and enabled to be moved around countries from places which perhaps have more energy to places that have less energy. There are also ideas like put your data center where the energy is and do your training there, and then potentially take your trained model and do your inferencing at the edge, which comes out to that final point from the gentleman in the middle, which I think is excellent. Yes, there should also be these smaller models that are specifically tuned for inferencing on edge devices, so that you also have that option and it's part of the mix. I think it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of thinking to combine all of these, because it is such a complex picture. So unfortunately, there is no one easy answer.
David. Yeah, the gentleman there is exactly right. And, one of the features of, there was a period maybe 6-9 months ago, training large language models where people thought small language models would be more effective if you train them against a specific purpose. And we all discovered that actually large language models were super good at that as well. And so we've gone down that route, and that means S3 not is getting used with a sledgehammer with it, which is okay from a use point of view, but it's not okay from an energy point of view. It's probably not okay from a cost point of view. So I do think those things will align. But what that will require is much greater thought into solutioning, into the coordination of different models and multi-model platforms, multimodal platforms as well, which can then be reused against multiple business cases. So you're getting platform asset reuse against the problems. And your point about edge, device-based computing is a really good one as well. Brilliant.
I am just going to finish off by saying, whatever you do, it's important to think about enough ideas that you can work out which one's going to have the biggest impact, and then do that. And that might be, in reducing your energy consumption. It might be increasing it slightly to have a different good impact. It's going to vary. So I'm going to stick with what we said and say it's complicated.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we started 4 minutes late, so with your forbearance, we'll just go on for 4 more minutes just so we can get 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, gentlemen here. Anybody at the back? I don't want to discriminate. Yep, then you'll be next. Thank you. And then that will be it. There's 2 questions. This gentleman, and then the gentleman with the what?
Yeah, so I'm at least aware of this. I mean, very cool project that DeepMind did, where they use reinforcement learning to improve the magnetic containment in fusion reactors to improve the efficiency there. I mean, that's way off, right? But I'm sure there must be places using AI to improve solar panel efficiency or reduce the cost of building wind turbines, or doing, all of these kind of things that can help downstream. I mean, does it make maybe are there any countries, or are there any policies, does it even make sense to talk about things like data centers are required to allocate 10% of their compute to projects that are actually going to improve these technologies down the line, or to subsidize the compute for companies doing that kind of research, so that you kind of offset the cost against.
Jim, thank you. Final question.
Right, I suppose that's me. There was a lot of chat about the growth in energy production by renewable resources, but of course the big issue there is also energy storage. So I was wondering if you had some comments on that, whether we run into the issue that we need loads of peaker plants being created to handle, at night when there isn't solar.
Great questions to end with. So I'll start again with Charlie. Final words.
Maybe just a very quick word on the energy storage. So absolutely, unquestionably, short, medium and longer term storage is increasingly needed on electricity networks to handle this imbalance between the generation that follows the wind and the sun and the demand which follows all our human activities and rhythms. In the short to medium term, in the short term, it looks like that will be either large-scale, like grid-sized batteries, or distributed batteries around all our houses, including the batteries in our electric vehicles that, when plugged in, can provide a resource to the grid. And in the sort of slightly more medium term, I think it's come down fairly strongly behind hydrogen as the storage vector, and green hydrogen production to generate that. So undoubtedly we'll need more storage. The extent to which AI can help in that sort of scientific space, there's evidence of that around, for example, new catalysts in battery science. But I'm not too sure there is other really strong use cases showing that AI is dramatically helping accelerate the development of storage solutions or the deployment of storage solutions. But they will be an important part of the electricity mix, no doubts.
Brilliant. So 30 seconds each. B.
Maybe to the gentleman at the front here. So I was in Brussels, also used planes, also guilty. Earlier this year, and we'll talk about it later. was lucky enough to see a really interesting panel on a similar topic to this. And one of the speakers was a climate scientist called Professor Douglas Rios from Barcelona Supercomputing Center, which is a leading center for exactly the kind of research you're talking about into how AI can be applied to climate science and also climate change mitigation strategies. And the part of his talk that I found particularly compelling is that he stood up and said at the beginning, 5 years ago, my colleagues and I were very skeptical about the impact that AI could have on our work. We were pretty convinced it was overhyped and it was useless to us. We were wrong. It's not easy for anybody to admit they were wrong, let alone stand up in public and do it, and he did it. We were wrong. We have applied AI to our work and it has been transformational. And I think that's the point that I would just like to leave everybody with. That's why this conversation is so important. We need to find ways to address these problems, challenging and complex and time-consuming that they're going to be. It is useful work to solve this problem because we need AI, we need this tool in order to come up with these solutions to address what is fundamentally one of the most existential challenges that we face as a society, which is climate change.
Thank you, Pete. Great point. Camilla.
So, one of the projects that my company Gemserv is working on at the moment is a project with Daws where we've been looking at where assets are, storage and generation assets, because it's really hard to know at the moment. And we don't know how effective they are either. So we don't know who's got solar panels really, or whether they're still working at a decent capacity or working at all. We know that because it's on domestic properties, things can break on them and people won't realise that they've broken. So there's quite a big project going on just to understand that at the moment. So I thought I'd just sort of, that's something that people don't necessarily think about going on, but that actually it's not just about making things that work better, it's about knowing what you've got. So that's my closing thought.
Thank you, David.
Well, we're out of time, aren't we? So I just want to thank the group for an amazing debate and discussion then on what is the single most important problem that we've got. And I think it's incumbent on us all to keep it fresh to the debate, because it is tempting for people to want to brush the whole decarbonisation and climate debate off the table, and we can't do so.
Yeah, please join me in thanking such a wonderful panel.